Before I begin today, I'd like to acknowledge that we are gathered on the ancestral territory of the Achachaman and Tongva peoples, who are the original caretakers of this land, water, and air. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which I grew up, the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people of the Eastern Kulin Nation. Sovereignty was never ceded. This land always was, and always will be, Aboriginal land. Today, if my mouse plays nicely, I'm going to present the current state of my dissertation research, both creative and conceptual. For context, I'm currently preparing my prospectus and will do my quals in the spring. My capstone will comprise two events, one desert event and one campus event. The desert event will be held out at the Burns Pinion Ridge Reserve near Joshua Tree and will feature Zala Cyclos, my collaborative project with Al Wixon, which many of you have heard about. Today, I'm actually going to focus on the pieces for my campus event, which I haven't talked about as much. And I'll get into these pieces more as we go along. Coming into my dissertation research, I'd begun thinking and reading quite a lot about a couple of very general questions to do with queerness and ecology and their intersection and how they figure in my creative work. The last question is particularly important because I didn't want to lose my existing threads of research. In my previous studies, I'd begun to write about how everyday objects figure in our understanding of urban ecologies. I'd also been interested in cycles of production and consumption, which is to say, in how those everyday objects are produced, used, and bestowed with cultural meaning. As we'll see in some of the examples I introduced today, Fluxus performance art often uses familiar everyday objects in surprising or absurd ways, as a means of getting us to reevaluate our unthinking relationships with mundane or mass-produced cultural products. Those of you who've seen me perform will know that Fluxus attitudes and aesthetics are still very much evident in my practice. Given that I want to use my performance practice as a way of exploring queerness and ecology, it makes sense to begin by thinking about how each relates to temporality. At some level, both queer and ecological time are characterized by urgency. Ecological urgency manifests as the urgency of attending to our biological needs, to the fallibilities of our physical bodies in time, their liability to tire, to hunger, to injure, to age. And ecological urgency is also an increasingly politicized phenomenon as our climate crisis intensifies by the day. Queer urgency shares a similar precarity. As with many minoritarian experiences, uncertain futurities condition how you conceive of your present. This has formed the basis of any number of critical queer positionalities, and I had spent a lot of time in this paper going over that, but I've cut most of it. It's not because it was a waste of time, so to speak, but because there are more urgent things to talk about. I was reminded of this mostly through Rajna's excellent guidance, but also again just last night, when I saw a news headline announcing that the very same youth trans care I received as a young person in Australia is up for unconditional review. Whether they are historical, or especially if they're contemporary, the perpetration of structural violences against minority groups, such as limited or uncertain access to healthcare, or indeed care of any kind, breeds a collective sense of precarity. This is further compounded when issues of minoritarian identity become hotly contested political footballs, and so the precarity pervades as long as that minoritarian identity remains politically expedient. Precarity entails compulsory contingency and flexibility. It entails imposed urgency and a demand to respond to unpredictable social conditions. Just like an environment whose future is in the apparently incorrigible hands of gormless, fossil fuel-funded world leaders, precarity makes it difficult for a community to plan for their own futures or know how to be in time, because they don't know if that future will attend to their basic needs and desires. These uncertain, contingent futurities, occupied by both queerness and ecology, will recur throughout my presentation today. Thinking about ecological time also leads me to think about cyclical time, the time of the seasons, of lifespans, of geological eras. In ecological time, periodicity could be anything from the rate at which a kookaburra's gullet wobbles as it warbles in the early morning light, or the ebb and flow of tidal currents, repeating nearly but not quite twice a day, or the sort of unfathomable scale of our own generational, ancestral histories. These periodicities are measured in experiential rather than chronometric time. Nobody tells the dolphins that it's time to fall backwards for daylight savings. Only humans, and perhaps the odd, particularly food-motivated house cat, conceive of time as something to be regulated or to be rendered static and concrete. Because ecological time makes us aware of how time repeats, it also makes us aware of how no two repetitions are quite the same. These events evolve in their repetition, a repetition in flux. No two ocean waves or gusts of wind can ever be identical, just as no two people's fingerprints can be the same, because these entities represent the complex confluence of innumerable environmental factors. Ecological time bears testament to the interpenetrations of these bodies and agents and forces and beings. Ecological time forces us to reckon with the inescapable fact that there are timescales and temporalities which we can never perceive, because their rapidity or their durationality lies outside our field of comprehension. Ecological time forces us to acknowledge that even if we can perceive some temporality, some rhythmicity in the world around us, we can never know for certain that the event will repeat itself when we expect it. Occupying ecological time means embracing contingency. I conceive of performance, and especially improvised performance, as an opportunity to activate and sound out the elasticity inherent to ecological time. I am very interested in ideas of taking time, of making time, and of spending time with other beings, be they human or otherwise. Taking time to, making time for, and spending time with are all characteristic of caring for something. And the concept of care is central to how I conceive of both ecology and queerness. My conception of nature is not one of hostile, isolationist survival mentalities, but one of collectivity and entanglement. Indeed, in discussing queer ecological care, scholar Timothy Morton points to both the importance of slowing down, of taking time to engage with other beings, and also the significance of understanding queer ecological relations as those where care is foregrounded, where we begin with an open appreciation, for no particular reason, of another being's enjoyment beyond mere toleration. We do not need any other telos than sharing an encounter, an exchange between beings whose temporalities and trajectories happen to have landed them in the same spatiotemporal moment, with the willingness and capacity to take the time, to make the time, to spend the time together. I often use the language of stopping at anything to describe how I can practice both care in my everyday life and also in my improvisational practice when immersed in a deliberate performance context. A while ago now, I had the unenviable experience of waiting for about half an hour in a very sweaty tube between the aeroplane gate and the aeroplane door. And this was because the staff had warned us that the carry-on bags would not fit in the overhead lockers, but apparently every single person in the line ahead of me decided to test that for themselves. While I was waiting in this tunnel, I had the opportunity to enjoy perusing the advertisements for our own university, because they were plastered over the entire length of the wall of the air bridge. The campaign template about a year ago was as follows. The ads each featured a different high-res photo of some conventionally attractive undergrad, overlaid with the slogan, "Stop at nothing," and then some ancillary text which varies from ad to ad. For example, the picture of a student in a pristine lab coat staring at a test tube held dramatically aloft might read, "Stop at nothing to find innovative solutions." The picture of a grinning assortment of multicultural friends, all bizarrely happy to be reading from the same library book, might say, "Stop at nothing to foster connections." Yet another ad, featuring a dancer poised mid-arabesque, might encourage us to stop at nothing to express your true self. This rhetoric of unstoppability, of ever-expanding innovation, is apparently supposed to be very inspiring. We are supposed to subscribe to this logic of inexorable growth, of glossing over the small stuff in pursuit of something significant with a capital S. Now, the point of all of this is, of course, not to besmirch our own university. We are all well aware of the many brilliant conversations and opportunities that are made possible here. And certainly, these rhetorics of progress are hardly unique to UCI, especially in the beating heart of capitalism and unnatural settlement that is the so-called concrete sprawl. But I do think that sometimes it can be easy to forget that stopping at nothing doesn't have to be our default mode of engaging with the world. I want to offer an alternative. I don't want to stop at nothing. I don't want to stop at everything necessarily, but I do want to advocate for an attitude of stopping at anything. Stopping at anything means attending to the immediate world around us, being attuned to its tiny flickers of interest that capture us for whatever reason. Stopping at anything means allowing ourselves to resonate with spontaneous and serendipitous moments of affect, moments of beauty, moments of interest, even and perhaps especially if they arise in otherwise unremarkable contexts. This kind of aimless, unserious engagement might seem fanciful or even a waste of time. But I am encouraged in this project by the writing of queer scholar Jack Halberstam, who in The Queer Art of Failure explains why recuperating the generative possibilities of negative affects is a decidedly queer practice. Halberstam calls for queer theory which locates itself in the small, the inconsequential, the anti-monumental, the micro, and the irrelevant. Halberstam urges queer practitioners to eschew grand narratives of mastery and teleology and instead chase small projects, micropolitics, hunches, whims, and fancies. I think of stopping at anything as a commitment to practicing this kind of receptive, generous engagement at the level of the everyday and the overlooked. About a year ago, Rajna suggested that it might be worth identifying a focal theme for my dissertation, and I agreed that this would be a very useful way to put my pretty disparate creative projects in dialogue with one another, and to concentrate my thinking around queerness and ecology. I thought about using the theme of water, which I'd used for my thesis back at art school, with its emphases on fluidity and cleanliness and rivers and waterways. I thought about using the theme of food, which figures so heavily in so many Fluxus pieces, and which really feeds into my concerns around cycles of consumption and production. But I wanted to lean harder into stopping at anything, to find something which could really embody my desire to activate improvisatory potential with the least likely of materials. My existing practice of improvising with found or often discarded objects got me thinking about the concept of value and waste. What is waste? Waste can mean deterioration, as in wasting away. Waste can mean not living up to some potential, as in a waste of time or money or skill or energy or whatever. Physically, waste can mean excreta, that which we throw away, or bodily waste, that which we literally excrete. Thinking in and around waste, I've become increasingly interested in the multivalence of the word refuse. Refuse as trash, as physical discarded waste, but also refuse as refusal, as a refusal to conform. Refuse has the capacity to refer to acts of resistance, physical or political, and to the resulting sonic and social frictions. By recuperating the negativity of refuse and instead activating it with creative potential, I can perform exactly what Halberstam refers to as a queer disruption in the logic of the normal. Each of the pieces in my capstone events will relate to refuse in different ways. The simplest way is by physically incorporating anthropogenic refuse, human waste, rubbish, into the sculptural form of the piece. Such is the case in Burning Bush, shown in the upper left, which uses timber in various stages of industrial preparation and degradation. Al and I, when performing Xylocyclos, have used many rusted, shot-out cans that I have found buried in the sandy, rocky terrain near where we sourced our timber. These cans are physical waste generated by humans, But Xylocyclos also explores what it means for the timber we use to waste away and decompose, either organically in its natural habitat, or else more accelerated and deliberately, as when we saw at or even prepare the branches by stripping off the excess bark. My campus event will probably feature more projects than I discussed today, but that is all to be determined. So let's forget I even mentioned it. I was supposed to take that sentence out. These pieces within the event are all linked in that they engage refuse in different ways, and also because they each focus on a different scale of temporality. The first time scale is broad. This is the time of the event as a whole, the time carved out of everyday life to put on a dedicated performance. I've been thinking for a while about how to activate the temporality of the event with respect to the smaller pieces that comprise the program. I want to create a sonic and temporal signature for the event, something that repeats and evolves much more slowly than the individual musical gestures. I want this slow, subtle periodicity to evoke the timescales outside and beyond event time, to remind us that even those temporalities concentrated into the act of performance can continue to exist after we lose sight of them or lose feel of them. I hadn't known where to materially locate this idea because I didn't have a sounding object or sculpture that lent itself to it, and a naked speaker array seemed a little bit too boring. But recently, I have started experimenting with pressing soft plastics, which is one of our more outrageous categories of single-use waste, into rigid sheets that I can then sculpt into weird, big, blobby speaker forms and use transducers to pump lots of weird, cool sound through. And this was not the slide that was meant to show now, because I was going to have a diagram of my weird, blobby speakers. But that's okay. I still need to experiment with the materials and to figure out which sort of sounds will work best, but essentially I'm imagining these sound clouds, as it were, suspended at about chest height, so that they figure as bodies which interrupt and inflect our traversals through the space. Both in terms of sound and space, they will be both anchors and obstacles, impediments to some flows and generators of new ones. I want to dwell in the little eddies created amidst these ideas of flow and motion and interaction. And I want to go back a bit so that I can use the slides that I was supposed to. I don't know where they've gone. That's okay. I want to take inspiration from the way these little moments of friction can reorient us from the way the encounter with one of these sound clouds might be reframed as a generative spark that moves us in a new and positive direction rather than as an adversarial collision with another body. To me, that's what orienting ourselves with respect to care and contingency means, where we approach our encounters with other beings with a genuine receptivity to their specificities and needs. We practice an ethics of care which is radically generative in its unproductivity. This is a care which is offered freely, without expectation of remuneration. This is a cooperative, contingent way of approaching the world, sonically and otherwise. It's important here, as a creative agent, that the impetus is on me, as the one who cares, to make myself vulnerable to the possibility of being transformed through this encounter. In thinking through the ethical commitment involved in care, I am drawn to the post-humanist, post-colonial writing of Julieta Singh. Singh advocates for vulnerability as a magnanimous response to oppression, a response which refuses to internalize or reinscribe those violences perpetrated by colonial or other masters. For Singh, mastery carries ugly connotations of domination and foreclosure, of neglect rather than care. And there's an important link here back to the precarity I spoke about earlier. What Singh advocates, and what I'm about to explain in a moment, is a consensual precarity, a consensual vulnerability, an act of putting oneself in that position as a way of refusing dominant narratives of mastery. The reason this is so powerful is because it is contrasted against the imposed precarity of minority contingencies like queerness and ecology. This is not exclusive to queerness and ecology, but it's the framework I'm coming from. And I just really want to highlight the importance of the distinction between having that vulnerability imposed upon one and choosing to put oneself in a vulnerable position for artistic purposes or otherwise. Singh describes in particular a practice of vulnerable listening, which synthesizes contingency and care with a distinctly ecological flavour. I dwell on listening as a critical mode of becoming vulnerable to the voices, human and non-human, audible and muted, that are always sounding even when we have not been trained or allowed ourselves to listen. Listening, as opposed to voicing that which we know. Listening, as an act that might let each other in, physically, psychically, to another's ways of inhabiting the world, to being entities that are always touching and being touched by others, even when we are not aware of this touching, even when this touching is entirely unpredictable." End quote. We cannot know what is to come, not precisely. This is why futurities must always be speculative. Even big finance uses similar words. But the capitalist drive towards expansion and control, towards security and securities, means that the status quo insures itself against future risk, against future uncertainty. Uncertainty and contingency are not allowed because it makes us vulnerable. It makes us vulnerable to change, to negative change, to loss. And so we insure ourselves, to ensure that the system reinforces itself, because that is what it is designed to do. It steadfastly refuses to acknowledge that someday in the not-too-distant future, it will not exist, because its infinite expansion drive will have burned through all of its actually very finite resources and made them into unusable refuse. But to speak that way is not allowed. It is toxically negative, and it is refused. Following Singh's vulnerable listening, I am thinking in my practice about performing both this vulnerable listening and also vulnerable articulation. Where are my slides disappearing? I want to reclaim the negative affects of contingency, interpreting contingency as an orientation towards the unknowable future which celebrates its uncertainty, rather than insuring against it or developing prescriptive contingency plans, which is to say, let there be no contingency, possibly unplanned for plans. Music makes sense as a medium for exploring contingency because of its existing culture of improvisation. Good improvisers are very good at embracing the unknowability of the yet to come. Moreover, good improvisers achieve some balance between the rehearsed and the spontaneous, between preparation and elaboration. As far as I can tell, we value artistry and creativity and all these sorts of things because they feel like a spontaneous, ecstatic emergence beyond the rigid frameworks whence they came, and against which their impact is measured. As I have already described, a lesson I have learned from Fluxus and Halberstam and now Singh too, is that the mundane or the everyday can be reconfigured as a way of achieving that rupture, that queer dislocation of the normal. And what more normal, more mundane sight imaginable than the supermarket? Whichever flavour of megacorporation you choose to frequent, going to the supermarket, or at the very least writing a grocery list, is just about the most unspectacular errand imaginable. This, of course, along with the multitude of vibrant branding and people watching opportunities, makes supermarkets hard for me to resist. My supervisor back at art school once told me that hardware stores were the best art supply stores, and I would like to propose that supermarkets are the best field research sites. It's hard to imagine a more contingent scenario because you've got all of these people following their little patterns of purchasing and their little habits of where they like to walk and the directions they like to trace around the supermarket. Moreover, supermarkets reflect the confluence of so many temporalities. Not only those speeds of passage around the store, but also the cycles of production and consumption which converge to bring us all of our weekly groceries conveniently packaged and on the shelf right beside one another. Even the temporality of putting everything in our car and carting it home in our private automobile is a temporality itself. It's the rhythm of urban domestic life, where the chug of that engine or the pulse of the indicator marks out the last moment before another weekly replenishment of supplies. Once at the supermarket itself, there's the temporalities of each product, each with its own complex product time of preservatives and shelf life, not to mention the sequential cadence of seasonal produce and holiday treats. There's the irrigation clocks in the organic section and the really angry freezer beeps whenever you've opened the ice cream door too long. In 3 supermarket events, I attempt to justify, oh, there it is. That's my SoundClouds, my trash orbs. Oh, and that was some friction. Oh, God. Here we are. In 3 supermarket events, I attempt to justify my own supermarket infatuation by adapting texts from 3 other writers who share my love of supermarket as site of serious cultural activity. My script features passages taken from the libretto for Robert Ashley's television opera Perfect Lives, and more specifically episode 2, The Supermarket, from Don DeLeo's novel White Noise, which just so happens to feature several memorable supermarket mental anecdotes. And finally, from a Morton essay cheerily titled, And You Might Find Yourself Living in an Age of Mass Extinction. 3 supermarket events uses a 1-page graphic score. Circles represent vocals, large circles for live speech and small circles for pre-recorded samples. I use different voices to perform excerpts from each of the different sources. The black blobby figure is the feedback part. The red line part is for bass instrument, and the dark green dashes and dots notate percussion. I also plan to add field recordings and sound effects, ideally with a generative algorithm or system rather than a fixed tape track. The piece's form is largely nonlinear, although there is a sort of soup-coded thematic arc. Since I don't have a recording, I will just perform an excerpt which has each source included.
Got to get your fire today.
Well, what is important to say? 2 people are in the aisle between the seafood and the pet supplies. They have 1 cart. It is hard to tell which direction they are taking.
Got to get your fire today.
She took my hand and we walked past the fruit bins, an area that extended about 45 yards along one wall.
Got to get your fire today.
The bins were arranged diagonally and backed by mirrors that people accidentally punched when reaching for fruit in the upper rows. A voice on the loudspeaker said,
"Attention, customer Kleenex stopped in. Your truck is blocking the entrance."
Apples and lemons tumbled in 2s and 3s to the floor when somebody took a piece of fruit from certain places in the stacked array.
Got to get your fire today.
There were 6 kinds of apples. There were exotic melons in several pastels. Everything seemed to be in season, sprayed, burnished, bright. People tore filmy bags off racks and tried to figure out which end opened. In this passage, which takes place inside the supermarket, one excerpt sardonically notes the proximity of food for animals and that containing them, before 2 characters in another excerpt observe a resplendent display of imported and primped produce, just waiting to be swaddled in plastic and taken home. In DeLeo's novel and in my piece, the sterile, food-safe haven of the supermarket is juxtaposed against the waste we incur as a trade-off for supermarket convenience. No one was around. I walked across the kitchen, opened the compactor drawer, and looked inside the trash bag. An oozing cube of semi-mangled cans, clothes hangers, animal bones, and other refuse.
Etc., etc.
The bottles were broken, the cartons flat. Product colours were undiminished in brightness and intensity. Fats, juices, and heavy sludges seeped through layers of pressed vegetable matter.
Got to get your fire today.
I felt like an archaeologist about to sift through a finding of tool fragments and assorted cave trash. The vast majority of supermarket goods come protected by a sterile shell of foil, can, cardboard, or plastic. Even if some of the materials are recycled, and even if you could repurpose them somehow, this is largely packaging that is expected to be discarded after single use. These are factored into our supermarket transactions as disposables, as containers to market the product within and to create that surplus value. As soon as the product is sold, opened, used, the packaging becomes not just worthless, but in fact a burden. We pay people to take away our garbage. I emphasize this disposability because it's something that has become totally naturalized for us, even though the concept of single-use goods is a relatively recent phenomenon. In his book, An Ontology of Trash, Greg Kennedy gives a detailed account of the advent of disposable packaging since the Industrial Revolution and modern urbanity. Kennedy argues that our current treatment of trash is derivative of a cultural framework in which we exist, for the most part, in a way that violently negates beings rather than taking care of them. Kennedy draws our attention to the distinction between taking care of something as meaningfully engaging with that being and taking care of it as getting rid of it, as putting those bottles in the recycling bin and putting it out on the street, as feeling virtuous and environmentally holier than thou, as studiously ignoring the fact that only 9% of plastic ever ends up seeing the recycled light of day. Kennedy highlights that in the case of disposable goods, we tend to judge them based on how minimally they force us to interact with them. Disposables are designed to be intuitive and easy to use, to be easy to dispose, to be easy to use and abuse and never have to think about again. The temporality of disposable goods, Kennedy notes, is characterized by a drastic imbalance between the seconds or minutes we spend using them and the extent of their petrochemically protracted lifespan. Philosopher Byung-Chul Han has observed a similar phenomenon in the context of snap judgment, swipe or no swipe micro-interactions on social media. These algorithms prioritize positivity, efficiency, and smooth operation. There is no space for dwelling or for redundant repetition. There is only doom scroll and more doom scroll, with its attendant percentage of doom scrolling past paid endorsements. According to Han, the smooth does not offer any resistance. The smooth deletes its against. Any form of negativity is removed. Uncertainty is rough, sketchy, and ambiguous, unclear. A smooth surface made opaque by refractory ripples and gritty scum. When surrounded by perfect, mirrored smoothness, we see only ourselves reflected and become incapable of relating with other beings in contingent, uncertain, vulnerable ways. In 3 supermarket events, I excerpt one Morton passage which describes ecological awareness as experiencing your world as malfunctioning, broken, sticking out. This incomplete roughness is characteristic of a world not smoothed out by leveled concrete and buffed mirror surfaces. It's certainly characteristic of the trans experience, where sticking out is almost unavoidable, and where going stealth is an undercover gender agency afforded to few. In fact, deliberately sticking out is one way of rejecting imposed oppressive smoothness. I was fortunate enough last year to attend a lecture given by the anthropologist Marissa Solomon, where she argued that policies of peace and quiet are deployed in suburban and especially poor communities as racialized mechanisms of social and cultural domination. We certainly see this where protest action is summarily stymied by conveniently avoiding questions of political righteousness and free speech to instead focus on villainizing protesters as threats to our precious public equanimity. These demands for sonic conformity represent the imposition of a veil of smoothness, the attempt to enforce a broader tendency towards suppression, homogeneity, and blissfully harmonious social order. We might equate such frameworks of control with what Singh might term behavioral foreclosure to the potting of plants, to the reduction of organic growth to the circumscribed limits of smooth terracotta walls and isolation from other beings, and the limited hydration afforded by a snaking plastic hose. Of course, some plants will flourish in such conditions, given enough tenderness, enough care, but others will refuse this kind of contrived existence. As agential beings, we can refuse to be molded by these smoothing tendencies. Instead, we can take the curious stop at anything impulse, that desire to spend with and care for those beings we encounter. We can stop to see how they stick out, how they malfunction, how they diverge from the norm, and how those malfunctions can give rise to generative creative potentials. I want to specifically apply this idea of sticking out to rhythm, and especially rhythm as repetition in and across time. I've talked already about different timescales and how those different temporalities interpenetrate across musical and everyday time. But I want to focus now on how each temporality sounds itself out, how these different flutters and pulses and rhythms are realized in time. Cyclical time implies periodicity or repetition. Earlier, I spoke about contingency as rhythm in flux, as temporality in flux. I spoke of contingency as a vulnerable orientation towards an uncertain, unknowable future. In thinking about how contingency figures in my own improv practice, I've been increasingly interested in taking small rhythmic fragments and developing them over time. This idea of contingent rhythmic development takes cues from Singh's account of vulnerable listening, which is kind of like stopping at anything, and applies them to an improvisational mode of vulnerable articulation. Let's perform a very simple little experiment. This is a sounding body. Once I've found a piece of refuse, my sounding body, how do I activate it in such a way that prioritizes contingency and which responds to the specificities and affordances of this object in time? I've found that one generative method is to try and find a way of making an interesting sound that derives from the physical qualities of the object, but which is also ideally bounded by its physical parameters. For example, I might choose to roll my pen around the outside of the can, using the circumference of the can as the determinant of its periodicity in a cycle. Instead of imposing an arbitrary pulse on the walls, I can hit across the sides, using the natural aperture of the can again as the determinant of that temporality. In this way, the ensuing sound is a direct result of the physical encounter between me and this body. The periodicity of the repeated gestures takes its temporal cues from both of us as bodies in time. It is a combination of and a collaboration between, a complex function between the circumference of this can, but also how long it takes the muscles in my body to trace out a path at a speed which ekes out a resonance from the can itself. That's not to say that pulses can't emerge, but I'm imagining something more like the thrumming beat of cicadas chirping than the tick-tock of mechanized clock hands. I'm imagining that exquisite stretch of time between the drips of a bath tap. When you're lying in the bath, you have the time to take the time to listen to it and anticipate it. Gradually, over time, the rhythmic gesture can transform, shift, mutate as I respond to the contingencies of this counter. I can incorporate aberrances in the rhythm and let the object trace out an emergent sonic trajectory. I can let the fragment become something else, allowing myself to release the strictures of the known and instead feel or play out the rhythm as it feels like it wants to be felt or played out. This exercise in performing rhythmic denaturalization is actually, for me, a way of reattuning myself to natural felt time, rather than the strictures of chronometric rigidity. This is a queer, contingent way of approaching rhythm, one which I'm incorporating in the pieces throughout my capstone events. Contingent rhythm figures heavily in the percussion part, especially for 3 supermarket events, but it's also the basis for Chop Chop, a performance piece for 2 performers with electronics, kitchen utensils, and many vegetables. While I was thinking about emergent rhythms in everyday environments, I noticed that chopping vegetables was just one such example of an emergent rhythm. The size and material of a given vegetable can drastically alter the rhythms of your chopping. We don't tend to think much about microvegetal rhythmic variation while throwing together a quick salad, but that is exactly what Fluxus artist Alison Knowles did with proposition number 2. Knowles was a core member of Fluxus, and like many of its composers, she writes prose event scores. Proposition number 2 reads simply, make a salad. Knowles asks us to reflect not only on the ambient sounds which arise during the preparation of a simple domestic meal, but also on the unwitting habits that condition the timing and quality of those sounds. Framed as a sonic activity, we can start asking questions like, how is the care taken when preparing a salad any different to tuning a violin or to coding a max patch? What do you do the same every time? And what do you do differently? How often do you do it? Do you make a salad every day or only when there's a family dinner? Is this some kind of meta rhythm to your salad making? Wouldn't it be kind of crazy if that mapped perfectly onto the rhythm of your chopping? Do you make a salad alone or with others? Does that change how you do it? In Make a Salad and elsewhere, Knowles subtly draws our attention to how the everyday is itself a repetitive cycle, a rhythm of sorts. Knowles contrasts this mundanity with the spectacle of performing Make a Salad to, and indeed making a salad for, whole crowds of attendees. Here is a little collation I've excerpted of a performance at the Tate Modern in London.
I'm buying a salad probably for about 1,900 people. And it's going to be up on the bridge, so that when it's clean, when we've all chopped it, it's going to go over the bridge. And that'll be a great moment, I think, when these different foods are announced and drop down from the bridge. Whenever you eat a salad, you are performing the piece.
It tastes pretty good. It's good balance of salad to dressing, I'll say, good ratio.
It tastes fantastic. It tastes like a beautiful artistic salad.
I watched the whole thing all the way through. It was nail-biting, very tasty.
Knowles has made salads for crowds of different sizes, and serving it to the audience is generally part of the piece. Naturally, this means making a lot of salad, and also a lot of noise. As I mentioned, the spectacle of the whole affair is juxtaposed against the simplicity and mundanity of the gesture. But making a lot of salad takes a lot of people and a lot of time, and also produces a lot of waste. Waste is inevitable, but I wanted to think about how little waste I could create while still exploring the riotous everyday sound of food preparation. I wondered how much I could sound out or even amplify the moment of becoming trash, the moment when the peel of a vegetable goes from being blemish-free enough to make it like the prize carrot at the supermarket to just another peel in the scrap heap. Chop Chop concentrates the exuberance of Knowles' larger group happenings into shorter, more stylized ritualistic performance. Perhaps subconsciously responding to the austerity of Knowles' prose score, Chop Chop features no less than 3 separate scores. The performance centres around a large physical score, which features 2 tablecloths festooned with vessels, vegetables, and various salad paraphernalia. Each performer also has their individual part on their table, and then there's also a big graphic score because I just couldn't help myself. Performers retrieve vegetables and return to their designated tables, where they prepare and then bring back the vegetables for incorporation into the communal salad. Gestures are deliberate but unhurried, and chopping of various intensities is offset by the rattly pulsing and rigging of 11 half-broken egg timers. I was going to play a little bit, but in the interest of time, since you were all there, I'm going to keep moving. Throughout Chop Chop, gestures are often performed sparsely on very small quantities of vegetables, so very little salad is actually created. In fact, in terms of making a satisfying and edible salad, this piece is a complete and utter failure. Fortunately, I do not need to judge the success of Chop Chop by caloric output or by salad volume. Instead, I can return now to that moment between yet to peel and peeled, that moment of transition from produce, from desirable product, to refuse. Because this moment is one that we tend to overlook in our discussions of production and consumption and use and flow. We tend to think of before and after, rather than examining the little passage of time in between those more enduring static states. This is the gap between when you initiate the improvisatory gesture and when you actually begin to hear it sounding. This is the gap between the rehearsed and the spontaneous, the constraint and the impulse. This gap has a frictional quality because the gap represents the opening of a queer, uncanny loophole between what we expect and what we perceive. This gap represents an uncertainty that is uncomfortable partly because it confronts us with something unfamiliar, and partly because it is so fleeting, since it elides the gaze or the ear by occupying interstitial murky zones. I locate this friction in the little penumbral shadow between pulse and silence, between figure and ground. Friction characterizes any physical interaction because to be contingent, to be in motion, we must necessarily move with and against the material reality of the world. We must encounter friction because without friction, nothing can be haptic and so nothing can be palpable. To touch or be touched, physically or affectively, is to encounter a kind of friction. This friction is not something I think we can notate necessarily, but it is something we can facilitate by adopting an attitude of vulnerable listening and vulnerable articulation in improvisatory practice. In fact, to be genuinely open to the particularities of working with other beings means being attuned to those frictions which indicate imminent change, which signal a moment of transition or flux. I think this concept is best explained by sharing an experience I had while developing Chop Chop. And apologies to Al, because you have no idea this is coming. Part of the difficulty in working with a conception of temporal elasticity is that it's difficult to time things out ahead of time. So I was doing a series of trial recordings, seeing how the different rhythms work together, thinking how I'd arrange all of these different events across the piece time. I drew up a big fat graphic score, leaving plenty of room for contingency and emergence, or so I thought. Because when I got Al in a rehearsal room and we started practicing, I realized that I'd made the mistake of assuming that Al would chop the vegetables with more or less the same timing as me, especially if gently sort of instructed during rehearsal. But of course, this was not the case. One of the reasons that working with the everyday, the ubiquitous but the overlooked is so fascinating to me is that we all have our own unique relationships with those objects, those routines, those ostensibly normal processes. Many of these solutions or approaches to figuring out the world and how to interact with it will have been learned from family or friends or perhaps YouTube tutorials, but they're always going to be unique. Of course, Al chops vegetables differently to me. A cabbage sound is still a cabbage sound, and I know Al would happily have taken cabbage chopping critiques. But in fact, this was absolutely a me problem, and one which I had to solve at the level of my assumptions about our everyday experience and our everyday habits. I rewrote the parts with even less vegetable material, because I figured that the slower and more granular we got, the more those wonderful fissions and frictions between our different intuitive temporalities would be evoked. Unfortunately, on the day of the performance, my close miking technique just wasn't good enough, and so a lot of that tiny, almost Foley sound was lost. But in future performances, that's something I'm going to try and ameliorate. This rehearsal experience reminded me that there are always rigidities in our conceptions of which we are totally unaware. And it also forced me to remain alert to other moments for transformative openness, where accepting the differences of another can be generative rather than a compromise. It was important for me to care about and take care of Al's intuitive way of doing things in order to facilitate their ability to take care of and engage with the vegetables as sounding bodies. It was important even though, and perhaps actually all the more because, they are just vegetables. They were cheaply purchased, they're ubiquitously available, they are largely indifferentiable, and nobody would get hurt or maybe even upset if we didn't perform this piece genuinely with care. But somehow, that makes it all the more important, but because it fulfills that criterion of the queer ecological practice of care, which springs from a spirit of generosity just because, rather than being transactional or extractive. The more I think about my way of thinking around temporality and flux, and given my positionality, I wonder if even more so than being a queer, this represents a trans heuristic to thinking about time and process. For me, the emphasis on contingency, on openness to flux or transition, is a way of getting away from queer as something that is just not straight, and instead moving towards the queer as something more figurative and informal, where figuring means still taking shape, and informal includes dissolving formal negational definitions. As I imagine it, this queerness prides itself on practicing vulnerability and practicing receptivity to what other beings in the world have to offer. It is relational in the sense that it acknowledges the interpenetrations and mutual influences which comes from engaging with other beings. But it also emphasizes that in approaching these encounters, musical, everyday, or otherwise, we must make ourselves genuinely vulnerable to whatever we may encounter, genuinely ready to perceive its unique characteristics and to care about them, or else we're really going to struggle to begin even conceiving of how a queer ecological practice of sound might teach us about other aspects of our everyday lives. Thank you very much.